So how do we start this? We have I have 4 interrogators, which is the way I like to do things. I'm as we were just saying here, I'm not much of a one to lecture. I'm much more interested in what people have to ask me. So we should start. We have Maria, Martin, Liliana, and Mariana here. We should start with who wants to be the first person? Okay, Liliana is going to be the first person.
Okay, so my first question is, well, it starts more with a statement. So during the pandemic, there were a lot of conversations about slowing down fashion, and we talk a lot about passion as we're all here out of love, and we want to be here, I hope. But do you think that the industry today can be capable of cultivating these dreams? And do you believe that there's a certain naivete in fashion in this sense? In fashion in the industry, do you think that it's a naive way of thinking that we're all here because we love it and we have passions and we have dreams and we want to fulfill these through fashion?
Wow, so we're here because we're naive. I do think you come into fashion because you love it. If you're if you're a young designer, obviously you're aware of what lies ahead. It's an incredibly difficult industry to succeed in. And I've always said to people that you can't do it for money, you have to do it for love. I think that applies to most of the people on my level in the industry, that they are all quite obsessive people. In fact, I would think almost everybody who works in fashion is obsessed on some level, because like I said, it's an incredibly difficult nut to crack for everybody now. It's much harder than it used to be even. So naivety. Is naivety a shield? No, I think people come into the industry now and they're perfectly aware of what they're getting into. So naivety is a nice notion, but it's not going to get you very far, because I think more than naivety, you need a kind of inordinate self-belief, and that will carry you through the hard times and maybe even carry you up into the good times. Is that an answer?
Yeah, sure.
That's the first answer, so I'll get into this. But
yeah, so then I have another question that kind of leads into the dream that fashion is. So it's, when it comes to activism in fashion, do you sometimes feel that it is performative? How can that be avoided?
The what of fashion is performative?
That sometimes activism in fashion.
Oh, activism in fashion. Oh, wow. Yeah, something like greenwashing, you mean? Oh, God. Balenciaga, we get there on the second question. Interesting. I would say to a very large degree, almost all fashion is performative. All the good bits of it, all the best bits of it are performative. All the worst bits of it are performative. Balenciaga, we're probably going to talk about that a little bit more, I would imagine. So I might bank that until I can do a blanket kind of thing about what are my feelings about that situation. Yeah, fashion is performative because getting dressed is performative. I mean, the fundamentals of fashion are performative actions. So if you're meaning that when the industry gets a bug up its ass about doing the right thing, sometimes it does do the right thing, because sometimes the right thing is unavoidable. But the rest of the time, the performative aspects of fashion, I think, are what entrance people to a very, very large degree. They're what makes fashion fun to write about. that what makes fashion frustrating, but then with the frustrations that you want to address and you want people to change the way they do things, the performance becomes a spur. It's a good question, though.
Thank you. But also, I have something leading on to this. There's also like, for me personally, I always look for sincerity when it comes to a performance. And do you think that this is lacking sometimes? That sometimes a performance is only done to please and not because you actually mean it?
That's following on from how interesting the last question was. Sincerity and performance. Performance as an act. Oh, human beings just want to please other people. They really do. It's what makes them such flawed creatures. I think that sincerity, if you do something because you love it, you're designing, you're working in fashion, you're making a collection because you love, that's what you love to do. Surely that's a sincere act. I can't imagine, the world is full of self-deluded people, we know that, but I can't imagine that somebody would go into fashion with a depth of self-delusion so great that they're not, oh God, I'm just answering my own question, that with a depth of self-delusion so great that they don't see what they're doing as sincere. No, if you're self-deluded, you believe in yourself, don't you? Interesting. I don't see how you can spend all your time, devote your life to designing clothes without being sincere about that. I mean, obviously at some level when it becomes a billion-dollar business, sincerity is a movable feast. Then you have things like targets and stuff, and you have, yeah. I think that's also maybe part of the Balenciaga answer when it comes that sincerity then takes a licking because there are all these other priorities that insert themselves, and you're so far away from why you wanted to be a designer at certain points, or why you wanted to write about fashion, even though writing about fashion is never ever going to be a billion-dollar business, God knows. But yeah, I think sincerity is your self-belief, is your starting point, and then later on self-delusion erodes it.
Thank you.
Okay, so Tim, do you think it's still possible to be sincere in a moment in which, talking about the business of fashion, everybody's asking you to grow up every single year more than double digits? So how can you be attached to your sincerity as designer and not be compromised in your aesthetic vision and also in the value that you want to represent as a designer?
I would say, yes, sincerity takes like I said, takes a licking at that point. No, I think that then you have to decide what you want for yourself. I mean, can we think about people who've walked away from that level of, yeah, Helmut Lang, Martin Margiela, we can think about people who've walked away from success, sort of, after they sold their business for hundreds of millions of dollars. But I think that it's such a I mean, what is sincerity? Sincerity is self-belief that you are capable of communicating to people. Authenticity is this huge word, is this big word in fashion that's buzzing around. Apparently it's something that people respond to, authenticity. Well, surely authenticity is sincerity. But then when authenticity becomes a word to sell things with, then it loses its sincerity. It's kind of the human condition. I mean, fashion is a perfect mirror of the human condition.
We have seen in the past few weeks how they have been harshly condemned for their controversial advertisements. But I was surprised because at the same time, not much attention was drawn to the news that Greenpeace found a very high percentage of Shein clothing containing harmful chemicals that were above the European law limits. And so I wanted to ask you why you believe there is such a double standard when it comes to fashion houses' behavior, seeing how Balenciaga sparked controversy, but the media doesn't seem to dedicate much attention to Shein, for example.
The Greenpeace issue was an environmental issue. We know at this point that human beings can be told until the person who's telling them is blue in the face that the world is going to come to a crashing end in a couple of years unless we do something about environmental catastrophe. And still people don't really seem to be moved by it. You put a child in a sexually compromising situation and every right-wing person in the world can use it as a stick to beat fashion with, which is what has happened with Balenciaga. But at the same time, what they did with this was ludicrous. I mean, I do, getting back to the thing about the industry's double standards, because I've worked in fashion for a long, long time, and the things that I loved about fashion when I came into it many years ago, say I love the photography of Helmut Newton, for example. Helmut Newton wouldn't be able to work today, probably. I love the photography of Guy Bourdin. Guy Bourdin shot kids in adult makeup, and you know, there was never, ever anything said about fashion. It was such a tiny little self-referential thing, fashion, in the 80s, the 90s even, when it started to become more of a global, when it globalized basically, when Prada and Gucci and those companies started democratizing luxury, and there was a Prada boutique or a Gucci boutique on every street corner in the world practically, and really the goalposts moved enormously. And fashion started to be scrutinized on the same way that all the other artistic endeavors of human beings were scrutinized. It fell apart. You know, it couldn't stand up to that kind of scrutiny. The abuse of underage models, the kind of inhuman working conditions of garment workers, you know, all of that started to be, it's not like they were new issues. They'd always existed. I think it's interesting that what happened with Balenciaga is, it's the same thing that's happened with, on a slightly more, slightly bigger platform, because fashion's moved on since the Gucci face mask. The Gucci balaclava, or the Prada, I can't remember what it was. It was a keychain or something, and the Burberry noose. And you look at those now and you think, well, how the hell did they happen? But if you understand that Alessandro Michele, when he did that balaclava, was referencing Lee Bowery, one of his influences, which was never really explicitly brought out at the time. He wanted to, but I guess because the outrage about something that had been on a catwalk 6 months before anybody identified it as an outrage had already sealed itself into public consciousness as being this terrible thing. It's when there's a funny point where, what is it? What was the old saying about Comme des Garçons, when Comme des Garçons did a collection of striped clothing that people claimed referenced Auschwitz? And that was, I mean, when you think about that, that was a lot worse than a lot of the things that have happened since, but there was no social media, so it didn't erupt into a global PR disaster. Somebody talked about when a brand's dogma collides with its karma, which I thought was quite clever. This is what happens now. I also, I think the Balenciaga thing was so misjudged. I mean, it was appalling to think that intelligent people had thought this was a great way to sell Christmas tchotchkes. You know, I mean, really. It seemed like the fuss to me was less about the S&M teddy bear, which had been in the show. After all, people had already seen it in the show. Then the documents on the desk and the Isabelle Huppert shoot, where she was a businesswoman, and somebody thought it was a good idea to put those documents on the desk. You can only wonder at the... I work for BOF, and we just had our Voices thing in the countryside, the English countryside. We do it every year, and Demna, we were going to give Demna an award, which obviously didn't happen. But I really, really wanted somebody from Balenciaga to come and explain why that ever occurred to anybody as a good idea. It seemed an opportunity for them to do that. Nobody's said it. They've done their strange delayed apologies, but what the hell was the creative point of that thing? I mean, so Isabelle Huppert is a lady, is a lawyer, is a businesswoman, whatever, sitting at her desk with documents. That document? So these are strange questions. These are questions that I would like to see answered. I think that there's an acute sensitivity around fashion now. Fashion now reaches into corners of people's lives that it never did before, all around the world. It is a global, it is a universal language, and it is spoken in so many different dialects, and the opportunity to give offense is now amplified to the nth degree. And this is going to go on and on and on happening. This will happen forevermore, no matter how many diversity councils people convene, no matter how many how many social activists they hire to scrutinize everything they do. This is always going to happen, I think. This was a particularly... I was saying earlier that I was really surprised that nobody made more of a fuss about the babies in the Balenciaga show. Nobody said anything about that. That was a very eerie moment in that collection which I found extremely disturbing anyway. But that's what Demna does. He disturbs. He disturbs, and then I think he's a tiny bit disingenuous about, the babies, when you're looking at what looks like a group of refugees who've been driven out of their village or town on the spur of the moment by invaders. So you've got people from a dinner party along with women in night dresses and men holding their kids, and the whole kind of weird panoply of human distress. And then he would say, well, I want to have kids, so this is my comment on, men who want to have babies, or talking about how hard it is to make clothes look distressed as opposed to making them look fabulously, desirably new. There's a lot of stuff there that needs to be unpacked. He's one of the few designers who I think addresses, because of his own situation, his own life, addresses issues like this. But then he needs to be, in a strange way, if he's bold enough to make the whole scenario in the first place, he needs to be bolder in the way he communicates what it is that he's doing. That's another thing about the aesthetics of those collections that probably isn't particularly relevant to this moment, but it's an odd situation that the world is in this awful situation, the worst it's been in my life, certainly, and the most chaotic and hopeless situation. And fashion is always referred to as a mirror, the glass of fashion. Cecil Beaton's famous book about fashion, classic. So I would expect more, maybe. I don't know about this whole thing. Does fashion engage? Does fashion offer engagement, or does fashion offer escape? I find I'm more enthralled by designers who attempt to engage us. Escapism is beautiful and the fashion fairy tale, The Dream, The Kingdom of Dreams, this new TV series, which actually is a wonderful, eye-opening look at fashion in the 90s and the early 21st century. It does tear back the veil, and I find that very interesting. That this show probably hasn't come out here yet, but when it does, you should watch it because it's very, very illuminating. That's fashion as escape. You see in that show, but then you see how the people who are making it are trapped. That's also another rather deep thing that I'll give this back to you. I'm really running my mouth. So.
I think it's very interesting the fact of being talking about disturbing, because in every other form of art you have the power and you also have the right to disturb. Thinking about music, cinema, art, why we cannot be making something is like making people reflecting and thinking about, only creating the glamour for the red carpet. I think we don't have anymore the possibility for disturbing other people and going into a segment that's controversial.
With clothes, though, that's with words or with pictures or with moving images, it's a different situation than trying to pack a comment on the world into a collection of clothing. I mean, you can make clothes that reflect reality, but then to me that's an art project, because there is something in clothing which implies, something about clothing which implies they're going to be bought and worn. And you'd need a very special audience to be wearing clothes that reflected what is happening in the world right now. You know, to wear clothes that you do have people who do that, obviously. I mean, Extinction Rebellion, when they're wearing, but it's a concept, you know. Conceptual dressing is, yeah, it's a valid thing, but do you see a moment where people will be walking through the streets wearing clothes that reflect environmental collapse or nuclear catastrophe or, you know, everything that is hanging over our heads right now? I mean, is that going to happen? No. You've got the mic.
Yeah.
I've got the mic.
So the second question is more on a different topic, and many designers in the past, but also very recently, thinking about the new creative director of Anne de Meulemeester, have portrayed themselves almost as an unicum with their brand or the brand they're working for, overly exposing their image, while others, Martin Margiela for one, or Phoebe Philo even, have chosen quite the opposite path, almost hiding from media so that people could focus on their work. Do you think today, in a time where social media seems to have worsened our narcissism and cult of personality, it is necessary or even just helpful to create our image, to curate our image in order to promote our work?
To be narcissistic.
To curate our image, yeah.
To curate your image.
Like,
to create your image.
however one wants to read it.
Is it necessary to be that? No.
Yeah.
No. Is it necessary to be a persona? To create it like Donatello or like Karl Lagerfeld? You have like a sort of avatar, almost like a living avatar. Is it necessary? No. Because Dries Van Noten's one of the best designers in the world, and I don't think people would necessarily know what he looks like. And successful. Depends what kind of business you want. If you want a bunch of influencers wearing your clothes and you want pop stars wearing them, I guess it helps if you have something that they can hitch their wagon to, you know? Phoebe, John, there's a lot, Rei Kawakubo, there's a lot of people who don't, Junya Watanabe, people who I love, Issey Miyake, people who never felt the need to make their lifestyles part of what they sold. I think again it's human beings. You know, you have actresses who are perfectly happy to go to premieres with almost nothing on, and then you have Meryl Streep. You know, I mean, you have wonderful musicians who don't feel any compulsion to prance around the world, being, you know, on Instagram all the time, who do well. I think social media has become a horrendous beast in a number of ways, but there are people who, you know, who love that, who love people who just thrive on. That's the dream that they live. I don't think it's necessary. I wouldn't ever say to people that you need to create a persona to promote what you do. I mean, you have somebody like Grace Wales Bonner, for example. Maybe you would say her persona is the shy and retiring. Maybe that is a persona. Maybe she's really noisy in her private life. I don't know, but she's not. I know that. But yes, so I guess you could say she has an image that communicates what she does. But I suppose that's a kind of narcissism. I mean, if you think about the way you look and how it embodies who you are, is that narcissism or is that just shorthand for communication? I don't know. But as far as big businesses go, no. Oh, that's a long no. Yeah.
The first question from Mariana was very intriguing. There's a big question that I think a lot of people are asking themselves, and is creative freedom at a high level or fallacy in the world of today? Because I think due to the uprise of social media, with everyone being able to access information and have an opinion on everything, right? There is a big difference between what is actually allowed to the big creators, right? And what is actually politically correct. I think the world of fashion today is, excuse my French, pardon my French, but is very uptight compared to what we call the golden era. So, eras, right? So I would like to know what's your opinion on this. How do you picture it? Do you think creative freedom at a high level with big coverage is a fallacy? Or do you think there's still space and hope?
That's kind of the same as the freedom of speech argument. That is freedom of speech, the freedom to say absolutely anything, regardless of what it is, which obviously it isn't. I think that I think that the key thing always is responsibility. I think. I don't know if it's really old-fashioned of me to say that consequence should always figure in people's thinking. You know, that creative freedom. I mean, is creative freedom the freedom to create the Nuremberg Rally? Is it the freedom to? I mean, I think freedom isn't a license to do anything, regardless of consequence. We know the damage that words do. We know the damage that images do. I can't even believe that a representative of the United States government could talk about saying that the notion of fake truth. I mean, there is such a thing as objective reality. There is. We live in a world that nature made. And we can divorce ourselves from it as much as we like, but if we look around us, the world that nature made exists outside our puny, ridiculous, self-absorbed concerns. And it exists in an objective way. So I don't know, it's interesting. This debate obviously is going to rage for the rest of our time on the planet. That there's a philosopher called Karl Popper who said something really, really interesting, which of course now totally escaped my mind, about something to do with freedom of speech. That freedom of speech means that you have the freedom to stop people saying things. If you have the freedom, if if you have Nick Fuentes, 26 years old, mouthing off about how the Holocaust didn't happen, you have the freedom to shut him down, where he is saying his freedom of speech is allowing him to say the Holocaust never happened. He's 26. Well, you know, why do I assume that young people might be a lot smarter than hideous old people? But yeah, so there's I don't know. I could talk myself round and round in circles on that one, but I think in fashion, in the design of clothing, creative freedom doesn't actually engage in issues as thorny as these ones, because you are, when you're designing clothing, you are working with a human torso, 2 arms, 2 legs. I mean, you're already working with a fairly, or maybe not 2 arms, 2 legs. Obviously, there's a whole other universe that's opened up to fashion in the last while. I don't know, the notion of creative freedom in fashion is slightly different from the notion of freedom of speech in society.
Hi. Hi, I'm Annabelle. I'm from the UK. I'm from London. And I'm an aspiring fashion journalist, fashion writer. And I read a sentence that I really loved in The Business of Fashion about you, that was that despite your years as a show critic, you have great relationships with everyone in the industry. And I think that I'm so curious as to how, I'm sure this is something you talk about in your fashion critique class, but sort of what role a journalist or critic has in terms of bridging the gap between people outside the industry and people inside the industry versus being super critical, if that is your stance, if that's your opinion, and how much you have the freedom, the liberty to really voice that without sort of burning bridges with any designers or people in the industry.
Well, I've never said I was a critic. I've always thought that I really liked something David Bowie once said. He was talking about how he was talking about a writer called Colin Wilson, who I also love, who wrote about very, very occult, kind of marginal subjects. And David Bowie was very influenced by him, and he would talk about him in interviews, and he said, I'm a medium. You know, I consider myself to be a medium between somebody like Colin Wilson and his audience, his huge audience. He would encourage people to pick up the books that he was reading or listen to the music that he was listening to. The way I've approached what I do is I think about it in the same way that criticism's a funny thing in fashion, because in anything else, if you read a film critic, you often read a film critic to decide whether you want to see the movie, or you read a music review to see whether you want to listen to the band or see the band, whatever, you know, read a book review. Oh, this sounds good, I'll buy this book. But a fashion critic, I mean, nobody reads a review of a John Galliano show and says, I must go and buy those clothes. I mean, that's the very different thing about fashion criticism, which is why it really never had the sort of critical canon that everything else had. There's famous ballet critics and opera critics and so on and so forth. But fashion never really had that. So I always, my attitude has always been, I write about fashion in the way that I would want to read about fashion. And I like to, you know, fashion shows are such, and I write about fashion shows as well. I mean, that's when I don't even really write about them anymore, but I used to. I write about fashion shows as what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing. And sometimes, if it doesn't work, I might mention that, or I would say the music was good. But the fact is that you know, if somebody spends a huge slab of their lives making something, I'm not going to tear it. I'm not going to tear it down. I don't see what I hate. You know, like, it's really hard to open a restaurant, and it takes a lot of time and money, and some asshole walks in and just says, this is terrible, and then the restaurant closes. I suppose people would say that's criticism as a, and people spend years opening a restaurant and then somebody closes it down in a minute of some glib little thing. This is me being Pollyanna, I know, and people would say that's a function of criticism, to create standards and criteria. I think you can do that writing about fashion just by commenting on what you've seen. I mean, I love people's influences. I love how they express their influences. This is a criticism in saying maybe they didn't express their influence particularly well. In terms of having relationships with people, I'm not friends with people. I'm not one of those fashion people who swans around being friendly with other fashion people. Just because I have my own friends. So it's not a big deal to go on someone's boat or someone's villa. It used to be. I think there was a time when people really loved doing that, when fashion people get paid so miserably, fashion journalists get paid nothing, that this is the only escape from their kind of studio apartment in East London. Or East London's now really expensive, it's a bad example. But
my question is, can art be forecasted? And does trends homologation lead us to a loss of identity?
Can art be forecasted? Can art be forecast? Yes. Yeah, because it's a reaction. Yeah, so you can tell what's coming down the turnpike, I think. Trends. What was the second bit about the trends?
Trends homologation lead us to a loss of identity.
Trends lead us to a loss of identity.
Yes.
Oh, well. That's the human condition again. I mean, yeah. People are compliant. That's why we have elections now, I guess. But can it lead to a loss of trends? Well, you know, the thing about trends is, like all rules, they're made to be ignored. I mean, that's what was so exciting for Rei Kawakubo, I'll bring her up again. When she looked, or punk, actually punk's a better example. Although Rei Kawakubo, of course, is the most punk fashion designer of all time, but except for Vivienne Westwood, who she borrowed a lot of ideas from. But when you saw English schoolgirls during the punk period, and the rules, I mean, there's nothing more, this is a rule, not a trend, but it does apply. The way that they broke, the way you'd hitch your skirt up and you'd rip your stockings, all that sort of stuff. So a trend is made to be perverted, and then it becomes an expression of identity. If you have a status quo and you fight the status quo, you're asserting yourself by taking a trend and twisting it. I think that's always quite brilliant. And then you have the people who wear the trend, who are the people who follow, and then there are people who lead, who disturb the trend. Like, that's people, though, followers and leaders. And I think probably fashion used to be more about trends than it is. I think people maybe have less time for the idea, because I do feel that people are much more interested in their own identities rather than an imposed identity, which is what it seems to be happening in society a lot. I mean, I can't even think of a. I don't know if what gender disparity is there with where people, the way people respond to trends. That would be kind of interesting. Maybe you can tell me. But yeah, I think trends. No, I don't know. I think they can actually be a huge enhancement of identity in a perverse kind of, way. Yeah.
Thank you. And the second question is, do you believe that metaphorically notions hunger and obesity are connected to fashion, which means that the excessive production for seasons leads us to a need of a fashion diet, of a break?
Metaphorically, hunger and obesity, so feast and famine. So fashion reflects that in its endless overproduction of things.
Emotionally, the desire.
You mean like on a sort of industrial level? As a sort of, wow, that implies... I mean, the people who commission overproduction, I mean, say the guys who run Primark or something, I don't think they're responding to metaphors about obesity and hunger. I think they are just driven by profit. And I think that greed is probably more instrumental than hunger or obesity in the, and if you're looking at, human flaws, I think that greed is probably more instrumental in shaping the way the fashion industry is the second biggest polluter in the world.
So my question, or one of them, is in terms of management and direction, we've seen a true reevaluation of not only brand structure, but the roles involved. Specifically, the definition of a designer has become a lot more fluid and open. We've seen great success with creative directors taking on an approach that focuses more on curation or styling. And similarly, some who have been in traditionally business-oriented roles have sort of pursued creative endeavors. You can take, for example, the co-founders of Sune. So for the future, what do you see being the relationship between the role of a designer and a business manager? Do you think maybe we could even see a time where there are creative collectives with multidisciplinary individuals sort of sharing responsibilities across disciplines?
I think that the history of fashion has been very much shaped by creative couplings of a designer and a business guy. I mean, you can look right back through the history of fashion, through Saint Laurent and Pierre Berger, or Tom Ford and Domenico De Sole, or right up to Miuccia Prada, Patrizio Bertelli. There's the most successful businesses, or the businesses that have sustained success. Oh, a lot of S's there. Have been that kind of pairing. You could even say that Balenciaga is Demna and Cedric Chabet, and Gucci definitely Alessandro Michele and Marco Bizzarri. For the future, that's a good team. It's a good team where you have a creative director, well, the designer creative director. I mean, everybody always had big teams of people and assistants and people who did the accessories and people who did the shoes and people who did the knitwear and people who did the outerwear. The days of there being, I mean, that's what an atelier is in a way. But I think the days of, the sort of solo creator like Cristobal Balenciaga are kind of have passed. And I think everything now is a creative collaboration. That's where I'm trying to think of a designer like Jonathan Anderson. Take Jonathan Anderson, who is one of the most waywardly creative designers who exists now. And you look at what he does, and it's so specific, and it's so peculiar and challenging. You think that must be one person doing that. It feels like one sensibility creating it. Then you find out that no, it actually is, that Jonathan might say he's not a designer, he's a kind of curator. I think the notion of curation has become like, we talked about the words like authenticity and sustainability, another word, but curation has become a word now. Designers seem much happier with that word. If you'd said to somebody in the past, do you consider yourself to be a designer or curator, they'd probably have been a little bit offended. No, it's all about me. I don't think people are like that anymore. Maybe somebody here can correct me, but I think if you look around at the way fashion is now, and you also look at the product, you get the sense of a lot of different sensibilities collaborating on a collection. you know, it's not all about the ego of or it's all about the ego of one person in certain ways. Get back to Balenciaga again, but I think that that's in a way what makes fashion so interesting for me. Not again, because it never stopped being interesting, but interesting for me in this moment. You look at in London, for example, the way the lines between designers aren't as clearly drawn as they were. They all work together. They all help each other, and it's a support network that I find really inspiring. And that to me is the way that we move forward. Anyway, we move forward. You know, we stand together or we fall alone. You know that, or fall apart. That kind of, it's not a hive mind, because a hive mind is a little less interesting. A hive mind is, you can see hive minds and other things. But no, I think in fashion, that is a good thing. That is a good thing. And I also think it's a good thing when the business and the business head and the creative head are working together really closely, because we've seen that it produces genius.
This might be a very obvious question, but I wanted to know your opinion on Gucci deciding to move forward without Alessandro Michele, and what you think about his whole era, and if you think it was the right choice for the brand, because we were talking about the freedom of creativity and expression. So, what's your views on that?
Interesting question. How far do I want to go with that one? I think
as far as you can.
No, I think that this is a funny thing about big business. My love of fashion is kind of tiny little things. I don't say I love fashion because there are $10 billion businesses in fashion. That's not why I love fashion. It's hard to explain to people that Gucci's a $10 billion business, and maybe the sales went up 9% instead of 22%, like they were at one of the rival fashion houses. 9% of $10 billion is what? Like 1.1, like, I don't know, what is it? It's $900 million or something. It's really hard to explain to people how that's a failure. But I think one other thing, among the many other things, he was very specific. His creative freedom, he was given creative freedom. His success story will go down in history as one of the great transformations in fashion, to transform a brand the way he did, the way he transformed that brand, the way he incorporated this universe of diverse notions on gender and sexuality and just the whole sort of fantasy versus weird reality. It was just absolutely extraordinary. You cannot feed people chocolate cake or LSD or something every day for like 7 years without them saying, I want to change my drug. I think that is what happens. I think that there's a sort of fatigue. It's an awful, awful thing. It's also a human thing that, you love the music of David Bowie. He does 100 albums that are genius. And after a while, you're like, I'm ready for something else. I think he's an amazing creative person. Alessandro Michele is an amazing creator. He will go on to do more amazing things. I know what he would love to do, and I hope he does that. And then as for the house, they're going to continue with what they call the studio, when the studio designs something, which means carrying on from what the designer was doing. The question is, was it his choice or was it their choice? And that's where you get into a sort of murky area. I'd like to think it was a sort of a mutual. I would like to think that, because he's got a lot left. He's got a lot of gas left in his tank. So we'll see.